So welcome everybody. My name is Lauren McCormick. I'm the director of the Marblehead Museum, and I thank you all for joining us tonight. A couple announcements before we get started. Oh, someone just signed up, Amy. I just got it. Thank you. A couple announcements before we get started. And the first thing is that we have two more events coming up this season that you might be interested in. The first is on November 5th, and that's going to be the last lecture of the season, and that will be a history of Fort Sewell presented by Judy Anderson. Some of you may have joined us earlier in the year for Larry Sand's talk concerning Fort Sewell, which is a little bit more about the preservation work being done. Judy's going to really be examining the 300 plus year history of the fort. So that'll be great. We're looking forward to that. And then our last Marblehead Memories monthly meeting. Every month we meet the first Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. We meet via Zoom now, and we share stories, anecdotes, any memories we have on a certain theme. And so this month's theme, and that's November 7th, that will be the first Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. This month's theme is going to be holidays. So it doesn't have to just be the Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa holidays. It can be Thanksgiving, 4th of July, anything, any memories you have of holidays in Marblehead, celebrating them, watching Santa come to the landing on State Street. And if you don't want to share, that's totally fine. You can just come and listen. So we invite you all to that. It's a free event every month. You can find the Zoom link on our website, marbleheadmuseum.org, and there's a Marblehead Memories page. And for the Fort Sewell talk, you can find more information. You can register online at marbleheadmuseum.org, and then the upcoming programs page. So for tonight, I want to, as always, thank our lecture series sponsor, Marble Harbor Investment Council. With their help, we've had over 10 lectures this season, and it's been great that we've been able to move them onto Zoom. So despite the pandemic, we've still been able to move forward, and we certainly appreciate you all continuing to join us virtually. And hopefully in 2021, at some point, we can get back to some in-person lectures as well. But we love seeing people come from far and wide, digitally or virtually, to join us. And it is our great pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel Breen from Brandeis University here with us tonight. Professor Breen has his JD from the University of Georgia and his PhD from Boston College. His doctoral dissertation explored the pragmatic jurisprudence of Henry J. Friendly, a longtime judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and perhaps the greatest of Louis Brandeis's law clerks. He's been teaching law at Brandeis on a part-time basis from 1998 on, and began the duties of a full-time professor in the legal studies program in 2015. Professor Breen, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you all for having me. And I'm about to share my screen and display some pictures for you as I talk. But before I do that, I thought I would ask you, this is almost impossible because the picture is so small. But if anybody knows the Red Sox player in that picture on the door right in the back of me, you can maybe try to answer at the end of our program tonight. In the winner may not get a prize of any sort other than our esteem. But see if you can guess that, and we'll meet back in after the lecture is over. So now let me do this bane of all instructors in the day of COVID, and that is sharing screen. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Oh, I think that might have worked. So we'll begin at the very beginning here with our topic, which of course is New England and Prohibition. And one reason this is a good thing to talk about is that New England really is the home of Prohibition as a national movement in the United States. This is a great place to begin. And one reason I say that is that we think the very first raid on an illegal liquor establishment took place outside of the city of Boston in Dorchester in 1632. So we have a bold claim here. The Boston area might be the home of the very first speakeasy in the British colonies of North America. Actually, as far as speakeasies go, we don't actually know where that term came from. We think it came from Pennsylvania in the late 19th century, although we're not sure. But we do know that the great apostle of Prohibition, the great advocate of state laws, eventually a national law, barring the manufacture and distribution of alcohol, was this man right here. That is Neil Dow, known as the Napoleon of Temperance, the mayor of Portland, Maine, in the middle of the 19th century. And it was his tireless efforts that eventually got the state of Maine in the early 1850s to become the very first state in the Union to ban the manufacture and distribution and sale of alcohol. So Neil Dow was a marvelous figure. We can't say everything we'd like to say about him tonight because there's no time. But to me, the most interesting thing about Neil Dow wasn't just that he became the great apostle of Prohibition in the state of Maine. It's also that he had a grandfather named Hate Evil Hall. Hate Evil Hall. Fantastic name. And we think also that the term bootlegger might have come from the experience of Prohibition in Maine. The old story is that if you wanted to keep your flask of whiskey concealed and you wanted to walk around Portland with nobody knowing, you just would stick it in your boot. And that's how we got the phrase bootlegger. But we don't think that's true because bootlegging as a term has many different theories of origin, and it may not have been that. Oops, sorry, it looks like somebody's not muted. But I think my favorite theory of where bootlegging came from as a term is an old ersatz mixture of molasses and old bits of barley, burnt bread, and they would put that together and they make an ersatz coffee out of the burnt bread and molasses, and they would feed that to prisoners, and they would call that bootleg. They called that mixture bootleg. So the idea of bootleg whiskey might have been something you couldn't really depend on, might not really taste very good, just like that bootleg ersatz coffee that they used to feed to prisoners. Well, be that as it may, we don't really know. But here's what we do know, and that is that the Napoleon of Temperance, Neil Dow's dream, finally became a reality in January of 1920 when national prohibition took effect. So specifically, Congress passed the Volstead Act, and the Volstead Act made illegal the manufacture, sale, and distribution of anything with more than 0.5% alcohol. That's what the Volstead Act did. And it became official through the ratification of the 18th Amendment, taking effect on January 16th, 1920, specifically 12:01 a.m. on the next day, really January 17th. Now, what a lot of people forget is that although the Volstead Act did make illegal the manufacture, sale, distribution of alcohol, it was not illegal to drink. Drinking was still legal in the United States. It was just going to be harder, one would think, to get the alcohol. And also, the Volstead Act said nothing about alcohol for sacramental use. So you could still have wine in your ceremonies, depending on what religion you were, for example. And also, if you lived out in the countryside, you could still make a hard cider. That wasn't covered by the act. And any family was allowed to make up to 200 gallons of wine a year for personal use. So you could still do that under the Volstead Act. So maybe life wouldn't change very much if you were, let's say, an Italian fishing family in Gloucester, and you were used to making your own wine. You still could do that under Prohibition. And that's one reason why boarding houses on Federal Hill in Providence, famous Italian neighborhood, did very well in Prohibition because a lot of people wanted to stay there because there was a pretty good chance they'd get some wine with their meal on Federal Hill. That was all perfectly legal. But everything else was now supposed to be illegal as far as sale, manufacture, distribution, anything of a 0.5% alcohol content. So in the short term, there were some real casualties of Prohibition. And in New England, one of the chief short-term casualties was the sardine industry in the coast of Maine. So Stonington, Eastport, those were big canning operations for sardines in the early 20th century. And before Prohibition, if you walked into a saloon, you wouldn't find pretzels waiting for you to munch on. Chances are you'd find sardines. That would give you a nice thirst because they were so salty. And the sardine trade now found a lot of that market dried up, literally because of Prohibition. And those canneries, many of them went out of business after 1920. But the cannery industry came back temporarily during World War II because sardines were a big thing to feed to servicemen during World War II. So they did have a heyday again that lasted until they finally went out of business in the late 20th century. So sardine industry, that didn't do too well. And there are also some major casualties of Prohibition among the leading saloons in the major cities of New England, including the city of Boston. So some of these places just shut down and they never came back online, as we might put it today. So one of the major saloons that shut down, unfortunately, was the old Adams House bar, classic bar in the city of Boston on Washington Street at the Adams House Hotel. And it was there that Calvin Coolidge was staying when he heard the news of Walter Harding's illness and eventual death. Pretty historic place. But the Adams House bar was a wonderful place to go because they always had this huge punch bowl set up held a three-gallon glass punch bowl, and you could get 25-cent glasses of punch that were just delicious at the Adams House Bar. And we don't even know the recipe of the punch. As far as I know, it's lost. If anybody out there knows the recipe of the Adams House punch, let us know. I'd love to see what it tasted like. But that saloon went out of business, as did the famous Lace Curtain Bar at the Parker House, just down the street from Scully Square, which you see in this picture. The Lace Curtain Bar was famous in Boston at the Parker House. Harold Nelson was the famous bartender there, famous for his Tom Collinses and martinis, highballs of all sorts. That went out of business temporarily, didn't come back until after Prohibition in a new form. And then Steve Driscoll's Saloon, a famous saloon on Atlantic Avenue, that went out of business. And the reason that was famous, Steve Driscoll's Saloon on Atlantic Avenue, was the bartender was maybe the most famous bartender in Boston, a guy named Dick Garrity. And Dick Garrity used to count the number of cocktails he made. And he claimed to have made well over 1 million cocktails before 1920, when the saloon finally had to shut down. He eventually came back and got a job somewhere else, but it was never his famous saloon, his favorite saloon. That was not to be. That never came back into business. Others, however, did stay open, and there were a few saloons that became speakeasies right away. That is, they went underground, they served illicit alcohol, and they hoped the cops didn't bust them. And one speakeasy in Boston that never actually closed was a place they used to call the Guard. And that's at an infamous location among Bostonians, right by the Department of Motor Vehicles on Essex Street, which you see here. And if you go just a couple doors down from the Department of Motor Vehicles, that's where the Guard was. And you always knew the Guard Saloon because there was a Minuteman statue above the front door. That's what it was named after. And they didn't go out of business. They defiantly kept selling alcohol, although they'd hide it, I guess, when they needed to. And that might bid fair to be called Boston's first official speakeasy, because it was still in business after midnight on January 17th. The Guard would serve 50-cent bottles of beer when they could get it. That's what they were known for. And they were able to get away with that for 4 years until the police finally shut them down in 1924. But I'm glad to say, in the true Minuteman spirit, embodied by that soldier above their door, 2 doors down from the old site of the Liberty Tree here on Essex Street, the Guard reopened as a speakeasy, as speakeasies tended to do, and kept serving alcohol as much as they could. So these speakeasies, as we're about to see, eventually proliferated in Prohibition. And one reason was geography, because strangely enough, members of Congress didn't seem to have access to an atlas when they passed the Volstead Act in 1918. Look at this border with Canada. Look at all the places you could get booze from Canada into the United States. There were literally thousands of different crossing points. And a lot of those crossing points from Canada to the United States were right here in New England. Canadians had no compunction about getting in the business of selling alcohol manufactured in Canada, where in most provinces it was legal, and selling that in the United States. And the reason they didn't care about what we might be going through in violating the liquor laws that way was that Canadians were heartily sick of Americans bragging about how we won World War I all by ourselves. They'd been in the war since 1914 because they were kind of sick and tired of what we were talking about in regard to the war. And then the other thing was Prohibition was in effect in Canada during World War I. So technically you weren't supposed to sell, distribute, manufacture alcohol in Canada beginning in 1914, but we were selling alcohol north during their Prohibition. So they returned the favor. Why not sell alcohol south? And they had a ditty, a little poem about Canadians who wanted to get into the business of selling rum or whiskey, especially from Canada down south. Sometimes it was risky if you were out on the high seas doing this. So that's why the poem went like this. So here's the poem. For some there's a fortune, but others will die. Come load up the ship, boys. The Yankees are dry. Let's see how much we can sell them. And we'll talk about the shipborne trade in a little while. But a lot of the trade came overland. And because of our border with Canada in Quebec and New Brunswick, a lot of it came through New England. Most alcohol from Canada went through Detroit. I'd say 70% of all alcohol from Canada went through Windsor, Ontario, and into Detroit. But some of it did come through New England. And one reason you could sell alcohol from Canada overland illicitly in New England was New England not only had a large border, but it also had places like this. Vermont was kind of famous back then for its line houses. And these were establishments, sometimes they were restaurants or stores, sometimes hotels, that literally bestrode the border between Quebec and Vermont. So half of them were in Vermont, half of them were in Quebec. You can't really do that these days, but you could get away with it back then. And there were these lighthouses like this one. This is the La Bounty Lighthouse, which is near Highwater, Quebec, right across the border in Vermont. But there are other lighthouses in Derby Line. There was one in Canaan, Vermont, famous one, as we'll see, in Richford. And these were places where if you knew what you were doing, you could get the alcohol from the back door in Canada and sell it out the front door in Vermont, as long as nobody was paying much attention. And there are some really famous lighthouses. And maybe the most famous lighthouse was in a place, this place, Richford, Vermont, right across from Quebec. And that lighthouse was operated by somebody everybody knew. Her name was Lillian Fleury. Her married name was Lillian Slater, Shipley, I should say. And she was famous as Queen Lil. And Queen Lil had run a brothel in Boston before Prohibition, and things got a bit hot for her down in Boston. So she moved back to the place she was born, Richford, Vermont. And she was in just the right place to operate a lighthouse during Prohibition. She'd literally have the whiskey piped in to the back part of the lighthouse for anybody wanting to hang out and drink whiskey in that part of the lighthouse. And she knew the right people to pay off, so she was hardly ever raided. She did really well for herself. And not only did the lighthouses do well in Vermont during Prohibition, but somebody else who did really well were the cab drivers, because a lot of people in Boston knew about Queen Lil's. So you get on the train and you get the train all the way to Richford, Vermont. You get off the train at Richford and there are a bunch of cabs waiting who knew just where to go, right to Queen Lil's. So the sardine industry didn't do well in Prohibition, but the cab drivers on the border did extremely well. And they wouldn't just take you to Queen Lil's, but they'd also take you across the border to this place. So you see on the map, see Abercorn, just north of Richford in Quebec. So in Abercorn, you could find the Abercorn House. And that was a place in Quebec, totally legal sales of alcohol. But the rule at the Abercorn House was that you couldn't order whiskey unless you actually had food on your table. It's not uncommon in the days before Prohibition. And they had that ordinance in Abercorn, Quebec. So what they would do at the Abercorn House, if you were coming in from America and you wanted a legal drink, was they would bring around what they called the famous cheese sandwich. They only had one sandwich, the famous cheese sandwich, and they bring it from table to table to table. And they put it on your table long enough for you to order whiskey, and then they take it away to the next table so somebody else could order whiskey. And by the end of the night, this was the nastiest piece of work you could imagine. It's a nasty cheese sandwich. But there's usually one famous cheese sandwich, and as long as that was on your table at the Abercorn House, you could order alcohol. And the cab drivers loved taking you from Richford to the Abercorn House because that was a pretty good fare indeed. Now, let's say that you were living in Vermont and you knew there was this whiskey coming across the border. Let's say you wanted to get in on the trade. Maybe you were an enterprising young Vermonter, maybe somebody from New Hampshire or Maine, and you wanted to try to transport whiskey, mostly whiskey, or maybe Molson's, maybe some beer, from Canada down south towards the markets like Boston, and maybe points south from Boston. So what you'd have to do is go talk to somebody like Queen Lil. And once they set you up with the bootleggers, the Canadians who are in the trade, then you know where to go. So you'd walk into the woods somewhere along the border, because there might be Prohibition agents along the border. You never knew where the roads went in. But what you might do is go through the woods and you take a few horses, and the horses will be laden with burlap bags filled with whiskey. And they go through the woods, you meet them, and at the nearest dirt road, you load those burlap bags filled with whiskey into a car, and your new bosses would say, okay, you drive the car. Now it's the middle of the night, all the way down the roads to Barrie, Vermont. So this is a really blurred map. But if you can just make out the capital of Vermont, Montpelier, just south of there is Barrie. And Barrie was the major distribution point of whiskey coming from Canada, from there to the rest of the US market. So all you had to do as a Vermonter in the trade was get the whiskey from the border to Barrie. And you go through Wakefield, you go through Waterbury. If it's snowing, if the roads are icy, it's pretty dangerous. But sometime in the middle of the night, you'd make it to Barrie and you knew just where to go. Somebody would tell you something like this: there's a service station over here. You go in bay number 2, you get out of the car, you walk around an hour, then you come back, and then you drive back to the border, maybe for another load. It could be dangerous if the weather conditions were not good. But the other reason this was dangerous was that if you're going down those roads in the middle of the night, maybe a policeman decides you're in the trade and they decide to follow you. Now, the New England states including Massachusetts, passed their own statutes after 1920, and they were called baby Volsteads, named after the national statute. And all they did was they gave the state authorities a reason and the ability to enforce the Volstead law. So if they felt like enforcing the law, they could. So let's say you had a Vermont policeman and they think you're transporting whiskey. They put the lights on, they're following you, they want you to stop. Maybe you don't want to stop. So what you do is you press on the gas. Maybe you can escape this policeman. And what they would do back then is they'd literally open fire. And there were several people killed by police fire in the bootlegging traffic, because the thing about the police fire was they might aim at your tires, but those policemen were not very good shots. And they're just as likely to hit you if they're going to aim at the tires. So it was a risky trade, but you would do it because one of these trips from the border to Barrie in the days of Prohibition might net you as a bootlegger driver $125. So imagine that, $125 for one night's work in the 1920s. That's really good pay. So of course you do it, if in fact nothing much else was going on. So you had the land traffic coming in through Vermont, some of that through New Hampshire, some of it through Maine. And the favorite way to conceal whiskey in Maine was to conceal it in Moxie crates. Of course, Moxie being to this day the official soft drink of the state of Maine. So you might do it that way, or you might do it maybe the more common way, and that is to get whiskey in from Rum Row, 3 miles off the coast, later 12 miles off the coast, where schooners, large schooners, maybe converted fishing schooners, would load up Canadian whiskey, anchor off the coast, off the territorial limit, and wait for the smaller boats to leave the New England coast and come out to meet them, get the alcohol, and take them to the consumers on the coast, to places like Boston, Worcester, anywhere where they needed it. So the second reason New England was a big center of Prohibition in a major, I guess, place of conflict in Prohibition wasn't just the border traffic, it was also the ocean traffic. And the reason New England was a great place for this ocean traffic was the coastline. All you people in Marblehead, this is no news to you, New England has a really indented coastline. Imagine all the places you can land alcohol in concealed spots in New England. You just had to get it from the schooners off of Rum Row, 12 miles out later in Prohibition, and get it to where you want to land it. So take, for example, the Sconticut Neck right off New Bedford. That's what you're looking at here. Look at all the little sheltered places where a boat could land and where somebody else could pick up that alcohol for distribution elsewhere. And in addition to that, New England still had a shipbuilding industry. And in Fairhaven, right by the Sconticut Neck on this map, there was a big shipyard, as a matter of fact, operated by a guy named Casey. It was the Casey Shipyard. And they might produce boats like this, the very speedy little boats. And maybe they couldn't hold a whole lot of alcohol on those boats. It was enough to make it worth your while. So you could be an amateur. You could have one of these boats. You knew where Rum Row was. You just speed out there. You pick out as much as you can. And then you speed back in. And if you knew who to deal with, you can make a good bit of money for yourself. And there are plenty of these boats being made all the time at places like Casey's Shipyard in Fairhaven. But it wasn't just the Sconticut Neck. All over New England, as we know, there are these nice sheltered coves, and there's a lot of them in Maine. So a big center of the distribution network happened to be the Harpswell Peninsula, one of those many fingers of land putting into the Atlantic from the state of Maine. And the Harpswell Peninsula had a whole lot of abandoned barns. So that was a great place to store alcohol once you unloaded it. And there were vacation homes in this peninsula, as elsewhere in New England, where you could store alcohol if you wanted to. Just pay the person who owned it. They were happy to get the money very often. And you just waited until the big people showed up to get that alcohol and distribute it in the larger cities. But the other good thing about the Harpswell Peninsula as a place to drop off the alcohol was that it was right by Bowdoin College. And Bowdoin College had a lab where the students were known to make beer. So that if you were living on Harpswell, you could not only get cheap beer from the bootleggers, but you could also get whiskey from them and cheap beer from a homemade beer from the students. Wonderful place to be during Prohibition, as well as almost any other time, as a matter of fact. So New England was a wonderful place because of all the different places to land this stuff. And nobody could ever catch up with all of it. The boats would go faster than what the Coast Guard had at the time, especially in early Prohibition. So they couldn't really get much of a handle on this trade. And if you take the 1920s, the great height of Prohibition, and you add everything together, we think maybe the Coast Guard caught up with 1 out of 12 of these boats trying to get the alcohol from Rum Row to the inlets where it could be landed. Just 1 in 12. But as we'll see, they did a little bit better later on in Prohibition. But in general, most of these small boats got through. And a lot of the people in this trade, as you probably know, eventually were fishermen, because this paid a lot better than being a fisherman. And a lot of people used to say that they would always know which fishermen were picking up whiskey from Rum Row because they ate better than anybody else, or they had better clothes than anybody else. And maybe the most famous of the fishermen in the bootlegging trade was a guy who operated off of Cape Cod, and his name was Manny Zora. And Manny Zora made literally hundreds of trips from Cape Cod, especially around Brewster, all the way out to Rum Row. He had his contacts out there. He'd pick up the alcohol, he'd load them in his ship, it's called the Sea Fox, and back to Cape Cod he would go. And Manny Zora had clients on Cape Cod. He had hotels who would buy the whiskey from him. It was all limited to a local operation. He did extremely well for himself until early 1933, when he made his last trip. And as he was going into Cape Cod with whiskey from Rum Row, somebody opened fire on him, and he had to jump off the Sea Fox into Cape Cod Bay, or I guess into the Atlantic Ocean. And that was enough for him. He swam to shore, he was okay, but he had the good sense to get out of the trade after that. And anyway, that was almost the end of Prohibition anyway. He lasted as long as he could. But the leading reason why New England was such a great center of the illicit alcohol trade wasn't the indented coastline. I think that's number 2. The leading reason was this. So that is Saint-Pierre in the French provinces of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, which I don't need to tell any of you, were the leading remnants of the French Empire, which had gone to the British in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. But the French kept these little islands off the coast of Newfoundland. And the wonderful thing about that was, if you were Seagram's, leading legal manufacturer of whiskey in Canada, and maybe it wasn't that easy to get export licenses into the United States, you could always get an export license to a French territory where it was perfectly legal, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. And here's where the schooners would come and pick up the whiskey and then take it from there to Rum Row. They might go as far as the Bahamas to pick up rum, but it was much easier to go to Saint-Pierre. Now, this liquor traffic in Saint-Pierre was unbelievable. And I'll give you some idea. It's only 12 miles off Newfoundland, really easy to get to. But in 1910, 11,000 gallons of whiskey came into Saint-Pierre. Only 11,000 gallons. In 1925, when Saint-Pierre really began to become the center of the liquor trade, 455,000 gallons came into Saint-Pierre. And there's only 4,000 people living there. And almost all 4,000 gave up fishing and went into this trade. It's much more profitable. And what they would do is they wait at Saint-Pierre, and here comes the big boats with the Seagrams. And the Seagrams was always packed in these wooden crates. And the crates would be unloaded in Saint-Pierre. And the people of Saint-Pierre would break up the crates and load the whiskey in burlap bags, because that way they wouldn't make little clinking noises when they got on the schooner right by the territorial limit. So they had all these crates, and they would use the crates to heat their homes. They would burn the crates. And at least one of them decided to make an entire house out of these crates. And you can still go to Saint-Pierre to this day and see it. It's called the Villa Cuddy Sark, the Villa Cuddy Sark, made entirely out of crates that the Seagrams family very helpfully supplied them. This place was profitable beyond belief. Eventually, millions of gallons would come through Saint-Pierre. And the whole place, it was said, smelled like an open glass of scotch at the height of Prohibition. It was absolutely unbelievable. And the guy who made this happen, the guy who made sure that Saint-Pierre would be the center of whiskey supply, a lot of it going through New England, was the most famous figure of Rum Row, the guy everybody's heard of. And there he is, the famous Bill McCoy. So I want to talk about Bill McCoy now for a second. We think he got into the trade because at the beginning of Prohibition, Bill McCoy, who owned a wonderful schooner, the Arethusa, a great Gloucester fishing schooner, Bill McCoy was in some turmoil because he was going through a difficult divorce. And at the same time the divorce was going on, his dog died. And he figured he had to do something to get his mind off this. So he said, I've got this schooner, I'll get into bootlegging trade. And he picked up a big load of rum from the Bahamas, managed to sell it on the American market, made $15,000 on one trip. $15,000 one trip. That sounded pretty good to Bill McCoy. It's way more than most people made in a year. And so he decided to get into this full time. And it was Bill McCoy who really made St. Pierre the chief entrepot of the whiskey. That was his favorite place to go pick it up. Now, Bill McCoy was like a lot of people. He didn't really see anything wrong with breaking the liquor laws. A lot of Americans, when they were supporting Prohibition, thought it was only going to apply to hard liquor, like whiskey, rum, stuff like that. But of course, it applied to beer and wine as well. And a lot of people thought that was unfair. They didn't know that's what they were getting. So one reason why Prohibition failed was people came to see it as a fairly silly law. I think a lot of people did. And Bill McCoy always thought of it that way. And he thought of himself as in a great American tradition. John Hancock, smuggling, the Revolution. He thought of himself that way. So he had no real reluctance to do this, especially because it was making him a lot of money. So what he would do is he'd anchor off Rum Row with a lot of whiskey. And he would actually hang out a sign with the prices. So you might not be a full-time bootlegger, and you might not be a gangster or somebody like that. You could be just somebody on the coast with a ship and you wanted to buy some whiskey. So you could actually go out to his schooner if you knew where it was. And the prices would be right there. It's like a gas station. And you could buy your own whiskey. And he would give interviews to the newspapers, like in New Bedford. And he would say, I'm open for business. Come on in. I've got all this stuff to sell. And there wasn't much the federal government could do about it because he's right off the territorial limit, especially at the height of the trade. Now, his specialty was that anything he sold, you always could trust. And there were plenty of bootleggers in the trade who would buy the Seagrams at a low price. And what they would do, no surprise to anybody, is they dilute the Seagrams. So they put a lot of water in it that shouldn't be there. And what should have been 80 proof turned out to be 40 proof. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people found themselves buying. But Bill McCoy wouldn't do that. He would sell you the real stuff. And his ship, he was very proud of, at any given time, was laden and laden and laden with all this Scotch whiskey. He made tons of money on this beautiful 114-foot schooner, the Arethusa, with beautiful sails, auxiliary engines. Coast Guard never got anywhere near it for a long time. And then he made his big mistake. And his big mistake was what too many people make. He moved away from New England. And instead of anchoring off New England, and he liked to be between Gloucester and Fall River, he took the Arethusa down to New Jersey, closer to the major market of New York. And it was there that he was finally arrested. And when he was arrested, they took him in. They charged him with violating the liquor laws, which he had. It's not much you could say otherwise. He was kind of famous. So he went to prison for 9 months. But don't feel too bad for Bill McCoy, because he was given the lightest possible minimum security prison you can imagine in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And this was so minimum security that they used to let him out to go see Yankees games. And he'd see the Yankees games and he'd come back into the prison. This 9 months wasn't too bad for him. And he had the foresight to invest his money. So he had plenty of money when he got out of jail. And he went on to live a fairly decent life. And he actually began designing boats, and he actually tried to design a yacht for President Roosevelt. I don't think Roosevelt took him up on it, but he actually offered. So this has a fairly happy ending. He eventually invested in Florida real estate and did well that way. And what you're probably saying to yourself now is there's no truth to the rumor that we got the expression the real McCoy because of Bill McCoy. So that's not true. There was an old brand of Scotch called McCay Scotch, and they used to call it the real McCay. And Bill McCoy just kind of stole that, and he began referring to what he had as the real McCoy, but it began as the real McCay in the 19th century. Well, McCoy got out of the business about just in time, because by the mid to late 1920s, the Coast Guard began to be better at tracking down those small boats that were taking the rum and the whiskey from Rum Row to the coast. And one reason was this slide right here. One reason was this plane that the Coast Guard began to buy, and that's the OL-5, the OL-5 seaplane. And they had several of these based at 10-Pound Island off of Gloucester. And this is by the late 1920s. And as long as the Coast Guard had these, that they could send the pilots up, and the pilots would find Rum Row, 12 miles out eventually, which was easy to do. And they'd fly up and down Rum Row. They're not arresting anybody, but they're flying up and down. And as long as they were flying up and down, the smaller boats wouldn't come out there to pick up the whiskey. They were afraid that the OL5 would radio the location of the smaller boats and the Coast Guard could pick them up that way. So as long as those things were flying back and forth, the rum ships, the schooners, had difficulty selling the product. And they could only stay out there for about a week. They would run out of food. They had to go somewhere else and get food. So that was a fairly effective way to cut down, although not stop the trade. So one thing was the OL5. And if they saw a ship fleeing, trying to get away from Rum Row, they were not above swooping down low and opening fire on the ship. They had Lewis guns on the OL5s just to make the ship stop so the Coast Guard eventually could pick it up. And speaking of that, the other thing that began to cut down on the traffic was this creature here. So the Coast Guard, by the mid to late 20s, was buying more and more of these vessels, and they were always called 6 bitters. And the reason they were called 6 bitters is that 6 bits is 75 cents, and these were 75 feet long. They were very small Coast Guard vessels made of wood, very cheap. They would cost about $20,000. The Coast Guard eventually bought 200 of these, and these things could go 16 knots. So for the first time, the Coast Guard had something that might be able to outrun most of the ships that were going from Rum Row to the coast. And that did begin to cut down on a little bit of the trade, but again, it never cut down on the whole thing. What happened on the bootleg trade was a lot of the fishermen eventually got out of it because the people who took it over were the gangsters. And they were the ones manning the small boats, not the amateurs, maybe not the fishermen. Once the gangsters got into it, that's when people like Manny Zora began being fired on. And they weren't in for that. That was too much for them, obviously. The gangsters were known as the go-through guys, because you had to go through them if you were an amateur to get to the coast. And sometimes the gangsters would actually rob the schooners. So things got nasty and more dangerous as time went on. But ultimately, this, as I said, made a dent in the trade, but it never stopped it entirely. And it went on until the very end of Prohibition in 1933. Now, I mentioned earlier that organized crime was involved in the trade very heavily. So what began to happen the more the 20s went on is the gangsters would pick up the whiskey from Rum Row and they'd get it to a sheltered area of the coast, maybe like the Annisquam River, somewhere in there by Gloucester. And what would happen is there's always somebody available to pick it up. And the favorite car for bootlegging to get the whiskey from the coast to the city, like Boston, was this car here. That's a Pierce Arrow. And the Pierce Arrow, if you loaded it just right, would have hundreds of quart bottles of whiskey in that car, if you loaded it just right. And they would take off in the middle of the night and they would try to get the whiskey into Boston or Worcester or places like that, maybe as far as Providence. And if a policeman were to chase them, they put on the gas, they could go 75 miles an hour. It's pretty good, 75 miles an hour. And if the policeman got too close, your average organized crime Pierce Arrow had a nice mixture of motor oil and ammonia already. And if you press the right button, that mixture would go in back of the Pierce Arrow and create a nice cloud that would actually obscure the view of the police. And maybe that way you could get away. So once you got that kind of stuff going on, you know it's the professionals in the trade. It's not the amateurs anymore. It's really the professionals. And that's characterized Prohibition, especially the more you got to the end in 1933. Well, there was plenty of supply of alcohol, as we've seen, and that brings us to where it was being consumed, now that we've gone through the distribution. And when we think of speakeasies, too many people think of a photo like this. Wonderful, well-dressed, sophisticated people enjoying highballs at a bar with art behind them. And I guess some speakeasies were like that, but almost no speakeasies were like that. Your average speakeasy was in a place like this. It would have been a dingy little back storage area where somebody was selling whiskey. They knew how to get it and they'd sell it there. And because these little speakeasies were so small and out of the way, at any given time, there were tens of thousands of these in New England. There were 30,000 in New York. In New England had plenty of them as well. But don't think of anything glamorous. Think of a place in the neighborhood that you just happen to know, where you'd go in and buy what you need as long as the police hadn't busted the place up. They were all over New England, but I would say the capital of speakeasies in New England, in terms of speakeasies per capita, was the city of Hartford, Connecticut. And the great capital of speakeasies in Hartford was Eastern Hartford, not East Hartford, across the river, the old neighborhood of Eastern Hartford by the Connecticut River on the downtown side of the river. At any given time, in just a few square blocks, there'd be 150 speakeasies in this part of Hartford. And they'd be busted and they just reopened again because he didn't need any space. It's just really a storage area and you could begin selling whiskey again. And it was just the cost of doing business. You'd be shut down, you open up again, you shut down, you open up again. One guy was shut down 5 times in about 2 weeks. He didn't much care. The 6th time the police showed up, he was ready with nice cold towels and glasses of ice water for the police because it was a hot day. Go ahead. And he just opened up somewhere else. So Hartford was a center of speakeasies. This is what State Street in Eastern Hartford looked like during the Prohibition era. And this is what it looks like now. Urban renewal took place in Hartford, as you probably know, went from this to that, very different place. But while it was the real Hartford, it was really a center of drinking. But other places were too. And some of these speakeasies still survive to this day. Maybe the most famous speakeasy that survived, that's still in existence, is the Hotel Vernon in the city of Worcester. Probably some of you have been there. And the Hotel Vernon is really a hotel, but there was also a bar there. And if you wanted to drink at the Hotel Vernon, all you had to do was knock at the right door. There's a couple doors there, as you see, had to knock at the right door. You knock at the right door, somebody would answer. They say, what do you want? And you would have to say, I'm looking for the yacht club. Worcester, as you might know, is not exactly on the Atlantic. I'm looking for the yacht club. Now, if you said, I'm looking for the yacht club, they would say, who sent you? And you had to say, Madame Rhubarb. Madame Rhubarb was the chambermaid up in the hotel. So as long as you said Madame Rhubarb, they would let you in. And you go downstairs, you sit at the bar, and you drink whiskey and beer to your heart's content, because the Hotel Vernon was never shut down. Almost unique among speakeasies. Nobody ever raided this place. Nobody ever shut it down to enforce the Baby Volstead in Massachusetts. And the reason was the owner of the Hotel Vernon happened to be a guy named Bossy McGrady. And Bossy McGrady was a member of the Massachusetts State Police. So this place was never going to get shut down. All through Prohibition it operated. And everybody seemed to know it, including Babe Ruth. So when Babe Ruth was home for the off season at his farm in Sudbury, he would take a drive to the Hotel Vernon, not far away, and enjoy hot dogs and beer down in the basement with everybody else. And you can still go there to this day, and you can see a famous mural by Al Cap of Lil Abner fame down there in the place where people used to drink during Prohibition. In this place, the Hotel Vernon is very close to where they're going to put the Worcester Red Sox Stadium. I think it's probably about done now. It's very close to the Hotel Vernon. So it's really going to prosper again. But it's never actually closed down. It's still there to this day. Now, Boston, not surprisingly, was the Walsh and Speakeasies. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Bunghole in Salem, by the way. The Bunghole's a liquor store now, but that was a speakeasy, as you probably know. It's a funeral parlor. And if you didn't mind hanging out with the cadavers down in the basement drinking whiskey, it's a great place to go. But Boston was also a Walsh and Speakeasies. There were 4 speakeasies on the same block in the South End with the headquarters of the Boston Police Department. And that was not surprising because Mayor Curley was a foe of Prohibition. And if he drove down the street and he wanted to honk, his honk played the melody to How Dry I Am, How Dry I Am. So as far as the South End was concerned, maybe enforcement was kind of sporadic. But there were plenty of other speakeasies, most of them very humble affairs, maybe like an attic in a place in South Boston. That would be a speakeasy. But some of them were kind of famous. One famous speakeasy was a place where business people used to go on the way home because it was right across the street from North Station. And it was called the Club Garden. It's actually kind of a nice place. And you go in there, you have a drink, then you get on the train to the North Shore where you were living at a very high class clientele until the police were under pressure to shut it down. And they finally raided it at the height of Prohibition. And among other things, they found 600 business cards of very well-known business people in Boston who used to go to the Club Garden. And among the classier speakeasies was a place called the Moulin Rouge. How could it not be classy with a name like the Moulin Rouge? That was at the corner of Tremont and Stewart back in the old days in the South End, close to where the Jake Worth Company became famous for being. There was also the Chateau on Huntington Avenue, well known. But my favorite speakeasy, for obvious reasons, was the Neptune Athletic Association. The Neptune Athletic Association at 358 Tremont Street. And the reason I liked that place was it was owned by famous Boston gangster Beano Breen. My last name, Beano Breen. No relation, as far as I know. But Beano Breen ran the Neptune Athletic Association, and the police were always kind of out to get him. They actually raided the Neptune Athletic Association 75 times. They raided that place 75 times. And 43 times, they literally busted the door to raid the place. And Beano Breen got so sick of paying for a new door that he eventually hired engineers at MIT to design a door that the police could not break. It didn't work. They broke the door anyway. But I'm proud to say that he never went out of business. He kept that place going despite all those raids. He had his own supply network coming in from upstate New York in Quebec. So he had plenty of the stuff and he would sell it. But maybe the most famous speakeasy was famous for another reason, and that's the Coconut Grove. So long before the Coconut Grove fire of 1942, that was a speakeasy, and it was located in what they used to call Cary Village because it was largely Irish. Now it's called the Bay Village, but back then it was Cary Village. And this was one of those classier speakeasies that you see in Hollywood movies. And the guy who owned it was the famous King Solomon, head gangster in the city of Boston, also known as Boston Charlie. So King Solomon was one of the leading organized crime figures on the East Coast. He's up there with Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Waxy Gordon in Philadelphia. King Solomon belongs on that list, and he was the one who owned the Coconut Grove. And his nickname was Old Slobberpuss because he always had a beautiful woman on his arm that could often be seen kissing. So that's the way he was known. Police usually didn't touch King Solomon. He operated with impunity at the Coconut Grove. And his liquor trade was very far-flung. He was getting rum from as far away as Central America. And it was his own distribution. He didn't mess with anybody else, his own distribution network. And he made untold millions in Prohibition. But ultimately, things would not end well for Boston Charlie. What happened was eventually the federal government got him on unrelated charges. They indicted him, and he's going to have to face a federal trial. And some of his friends in the organized crime community might have been a little bit fearful that he was going to turn on them. We'll never know exactly what happened. All we know is this, that one night he was at the Coconut Grove as usual. His wife was down in Taunton at their house, but he had a couple women on both his arms. And in the early hours of the morning, he decided to leave the Coconut Grove, and he took $4,600 out of the safe, put it in his pocket, and he went down to the South End to another famous speakeasy, the Cotton Club, in the South End. And he was sitting at that table to the left with these friends of his, and he got up from the table, went to use the restroom, and these two guys from the other side of the Cotton Club, the other side of that bar, they got up, and their names were eventually in the paper, Skeeter Coyne and James Scully. And those two followed King Solomon into the restroom. They gunned him down in the restroom. And Solomon's last words were, "The rats got me, the rats got me." And that was the end of King Solomon, shot in the South End in the very last days of Prohibition in 1933. Coyne and Scully got away, and they were eventually arrested. And they said they had nothing to do with the murder, but they couldn't quite explain why they left the Cotton Club, got in a car, and drove straight to Jacksonville, Florida, if they had nothing to do with the murder. That was a hard thing for them to explain. So they were eventually convicted. However, of all the states in the Union, we talked about Hartford, we talked about Vermont, we talked about Massachusetts, but of all the states in the Union, no state was more fervently anti-prohibition than our own neighbor, Rhode Island. Rhode Island is a heavily Catholic state. They saw nothing wrong with wine in general. In the culture of Rhode Island was something that reacted against prohibition. Rhode Island was one of only two states never to ratify the 18th Amendment. And the other one, I'm proud to say, was Connecticut, Rhode Island and Connecticut. Now, if you lived in Rhode Island, there was never a shortage of alcohol. And the reason was that Boston Charlie had an associate in Rhode Island, and his name was Danny Walsh. Danny Walsh was a great self-made success story. He was working at a mill for $5 a week when Prohibition began. And what he decided to do was go into bootlegging in a big way. And ultimately, he had two mansions by 1925, and he actually had his own horse farm in southern Rhode Island. He was making hundreds of thousands in the business, doing very well. And his headquarters were on Block Island because a lot of the whiskey that he got would be stored on Block Island before it got to the restaurant island. And this speakeasy where he used to hang out is still in existence today on Block Island, the Yellow Kittens Tavern. Danny Walsh did great. He was making all sorts of money until Boston Charlie was shot down. And I think the same people who wanted him dead wanted Danny Walsh dead. So Danny Walsh disappeared and nobody knows what became of him. Still a mystery to this day. Attention has fastened on a guy named Carl Reddick, another bootlegger who had a mansion in Warwick called the Murder Castle. It doesn't sound good, the Murder Castle, 20-room mansion. And we think he might have had something to do with it because Carl Reddick is credited with the expression cement shoes. You load somebody with cement and you put them in the water. So yeah, it could have been him, but we'll never know because that's a mystery to this day. Well, we're getting about to the end, but I did want to point out that these weren't the only sources of alcohol. A lot of it came in from Quebec overland, more came in from the ocean. But if you were a brewery, Prohibition meant you didn't necessarily have to shut down. You couldn't sell beer like you usually did, but what you could do is sell this wretched concoction, near beer. So Anheuser-Busch was selling Bevo, and all that was less than 5.5% alcohol, kind of a bread liquid, if you want to call it that. So Anheuser-Busch would sell Bevo. Other of these awful brands were Famo, Yippo, Kip, Bone Dry. So you could have the illusion of drinking beer when you really drinking beer. And here in New England, we had Pickwick Pale. And Pickwick Pale was not Pickwick Ale. Pickwick Pale was just near beer, just barely near beer. And you could buy that if you wanted to, as bad as it probably tasted. But the thing about these breweries is, in order to get to the near beer, they had to start with the usual beer and they had distilled the alcohol out of it, like the malty alcohol out of it. So they had all this malt left over and they would sell that malt to people who wanted to buy it. And you could then home brew your own beer with the malt. But they would always say we're selling the malt for baking purposes. Don't make beer out of this. Don't do that. But they would sell it anyway. And so some of them got by during Prohibition, although a lot of them did have to close. And finally, under Prohibition, you could buy patent medicines. And here in New England, we are the home of patent medicines. The very first patent medicine was pioneered in Lynn, Massachusetts by the unforgettable Lydia Pinkham. So patent medicine, so-called patent medicines were technically legal, although under some circumstances they would crack down on them. But as I said at the very beginning, doctors could still prescribe alcohol for medicinal use. And doctors did that. One guy, a guy named Dr. Kramer, wrote 475 whiskey prescriptions in one day. Whiskey prescriptions in one day. And often they would put on the prescription a stimulant to stimulate you. That's the prescription. And they could go to the pharmacy and they could get whiskey by prescription. And Massachusetts was one of the great capitals of these alcohol prescriptions. I'm proud to say that in 1923 alone, 1,449 gallons of rum, 1,449 gallons of rum were prescribed by Massachusetts doctors for medicinal purposes, and more of that in whiskey. And no wonder Walgreens prospered during Prohibition. By some accounts, Walgreens went from 20 stores in 1920 to 500 stores by 1930. Everybody needs a place to go get these prescriptions filled, and you could do that during Prohibition. So we're coming to about the end because I wanted to leave time for questions and comments. So I just wanted to add at the very end here that eventually this experiment, as we know, did fail. It did cut down on drinking to some extent. And it was probably good for a lot of people's health if they decided they didn't want to break the law. But eventually it did end because the supply was never cordoned off. There was still plenty of alcohol for people who wanted it. And it encouraged law breaking. It encouraged organized crime. And a lot of people figured the time to end it has finally come during the Depression, because during the Depression, how could you argue against spurring the economy to some extent, the legitimate economy to some extent, by letting distilleries reopen and breweries reopen that had to close during Prohibition? So you wanted the bars, the restaurants to do better. And so Prohibition eventually ended in 1933. So maybe now would be a good time to stop sharing the screen. And if anybody has any questions or comments, this would be a good time to ask. But also, does anybody know who that is? Do you have any guesses? Whoops. Who that picture is? And if there's no guesses, we can go right to the questions and comments.
Is it Carlton Fisk?
Carlton Fisk is an excellent guess. He played with Carlton Fisk. He was on the same team. Very good guess. He was not as good as Carlton Fisk. The answer is Billy Canigliaro. And I don't know why Billy Canigliaro is in my door, but he is. So that's the answer to the question. All right. Now, do we have any of your questions? We have about 5 minutes left.
Daniel, great lecture. I've heard stories that it was sometimes dangerous to buy booze from, various people whom you knew nothing about their background, and that people sometimes would send a small sample of the booze they had purchased to a drugstore or a chemist to have it tested to see. Is that true? I mean, did that really happen?
Yeah, I've heard about that happening, as a matter of fact. You really had to be careful, because if you wanted to make some kind of alcoholic mixture out of something like an industrial alcohol, you'd literally be risking your life that way, because the federal government literally put a solvent in industrial alcohol to discourage people from drinking it. It was literally poisonous. So if you were to try that, you'd be taking your life in your hands. So you always want to get tested, anything that you manage to get from somebody. Some people put embalming fluid in whatever they were making up. There were illegal stills all over New England, and who knows what went into those stills. So if you wanted to buy from somebody like that, you were taking a risk. And if you knew what you were doing, I would think getting it tested would be a very good idea. Yes.
I have a question. I'm curious, with all the access to the alcohol and people like King Solomon, would you say that, is there a reason that New England's organized crime never sort of became to the same extent, it seems, unless I'm wrong, than Chicago or New York? Maybe not as deadly, not as present in the cultural sensibilities?
Yeah, I wonder why that is. I think one reason might be that Boston was never the great media center that New York was and Chicago was. In Chicago was really the center of the distribution after Detroit. So that's where a lot of it went for points west in south towards the Mexican border. So probably one reason would be it wasn't as highly publicized here as it was in New York and in Chicago. And it was less violent in Boston. So Chicago always made the headlines because there really were rival gang wars in Chicago. But that was much less true in Boston. There was some rivalry in Boston, but it wasn't nearly as murderous as it was in Chicago. So it didn't make the headlines and people didn't know as much about it. So that's one answer. The other answer may be that New York and Chicago were centers of distribution points. So anybody that needed alcohol through the network were often originally getting it through New York distributors or Chicago distributors. And Boston's network was much smaller, so maybe their share of the market was less and they wouldn't have been as well known. But that's about all I could think to help explain that. Oh yeah, Katie.
Yeah. Am I on or yeah? So I'm just, the Rum Road that's 12 miles out from the main coast. I'm still not, I don't have a clear idea. Are they moving around up and down the coast, or are they really kind of fixed? Everybody knows exactly where they are and they can just thumb their nose because they're 12 miles out.
It's fixed. Everybody knows where it is. So they don't calculate the 12 miles from each little inlet, like all the way towards the mainland. You draw a line from the promontories of the outermost parts of the mainland. So all those little fingers of land, draw a line from the bottommost part of the finger, and then it's the exact 12 miles out. So they don't know where it is.
They weren't harassed in some way in the international waters so that they had to even move up and down the coast.
Well, eventually they were,
yeah,
because the Supreme Court allowed for doctrine of hot pursuit. So if you were within the limit, then you left the unit, the Coast Guard could chase you. Okay. And the law originally was that as long as you got out, they couldn't go after you. But hot pursuit means they could. And that made it more difficult for them too. Mr. Lang over there might be a Navy kind of guy, so he might know more about that. Do you want to chime in?
No, I don't. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. So hot pursuit is an Overwindle Holmes Supreme Court opinion, I believe, hot pursuit. And once the Coast Guard could do that, they could catch up with more of the rum runners. That might have been what happened to Bill McCoy. I can't remember now. But it became more difficult for them after that. But the big problem was never enough personnel for the Coast Guard and never enough ships, despite the 6 bidders.
Yeah.
Now the Coast Guard was really hard pressed to man all the ships that it did have. And what they had to do was change the course of instruction of the Coast Guard Academy. So instead of 3 years, it was 2 years, because they needed personnel so much to man these ships. But it was never quite enough. You could usually get away with it if you had a little bit of luck.
Okay, thanks.
Well, and just to chime in quickly there, if you ever look at old editions of the Marblehead Messenger from Abbott Library, there are stories of Marblehead in Rum Row and the Coast Guard actually going after some of the ships off of Marblehead. So you should check out those archives there.
Yeah, I should have looked at those. That's interesting.
Rather know where is.
I have a question for you. Did you say that Connecticut and Rhode Island were the only 2 states that didn't pass the amendment?
No, well, they didn't ratify it. It didn't matter because it went to the Constitution anyway. But they didn't ratify
Okay.
it. Yeah.
All right. So why was Hartford such a center, or was it just any city that was along the Connecticut River?
Well, Hartford was pretty centrally located, so they could get stuff from Boston and New York. They're right there. That was a big advantage for them. It had a large immigrant population, a large millworking population, and they were accustomed to, as part of their culture, drinking from time to time. So the speakeasies were heavily concentrated there. So when I say the capital of speakeasies, it's really per capita. So in terms of the population of Hartford, they probably had the most speakeasies per person.
Thank you.
This sounds kind of Hollywoodish, but were there any staged raids, where the place would get, the speakeasy would be notified in advance and the police would show up, and it was done basically for publicity for the local police department?
Oh yeah, they would do that a lot. That was pretty common in Boston. And there were some big exposés in the Boston Herald about that. So you don't really care about this trade. You notify these people in advance. Nobody's really arrested. If they are arrested, they get right out. It's all staged because you want us to think you're enforcing the law when you're really not. So if you go through the old issues of the Globe and the Herald, you'll read about just that. So I know about the situation in Boston, but I'm pretty sure it occurred elsewhere too.
Cool.
Okay.
Any
Got a
final
book?
Yeah. Do you have is this research published right now, Daniel?
Oh, no, I just got it from various bits and pieces. That's all. Nothing really published.
We'll put it together.
Yeah.
Good idea. Good idea.
Get on that.
Yeah, I'm grateful to everybody else who came up with the information. I just put it all together.
It's great.
Well, that was a
I'm
great
grateful to all of you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. That was a great presentation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great night, and I hope to see you on November 5th for the Fort Sewell talk. Take care. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.